Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on social media. All right, we have our headlines edition for January today. I was just coming back from the holidays last week when we would normally have slotted this in. We have a new member of the podcast audience this week, and I mean that literal audience watching me record, and that is Dracula, who is a new rescue dog that my dog Gordy and I are bringing into the pack. So if you hear some roughhousing behind me, I'm going to try to edit them out, but apologies in advance. Everybody's sleeping right now. Hopefully we can keep it that way. It was snowing all day on the day that I recorded this, so we went out into the snow and played, so everybody's super tired right now. Let's hope it keeps up. I'll see if I can figure out a way to get a photo of Dracula into the episode art or the show notes. So you can tell right off the bat how he got the name Dracula. His ears look like a vampire bat. It's very cute. We're going to stick with Capitol Hill stuff for this episode. I do have some other stories from the Imprint and elsewhere that I will riff on in the February headlines. But a lot happened or was released in the waning weeks of 2024 and early 2025 up in Washington. We're going to start with a particularly unfortunate incident from mid-December involving the arrest of a former foster youth and advocate at an event at the Rayburn building. I'm going to link and very strongly recommend people read our coverage at the Imprint about what happened here. But since I was actually in attendance and on the scene, so to speak, I'll give a little bit of a rundown of what transpired and where things stand now. So in mid-December, really right before the holiday season kind of got into full swing, a coalition of advocacy groups for youth who have experienced foster care or are in foster care under the name of Journey to Success held a multi-day event on Capitol Hill that was meant to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the passage of the Foster Care Independence Act of 1999, which more people will recognize or be familiar with as the Chafee Act. And it precipitated the John Chafee Foster Care Program for Successful Transition to Adulthood. If you're not familiar with the Chafee Act, this is about $140 million that go out to states every year to support the transition into adulthood for young adults who experience foster care, along with an educational training voucher program, or ETV, which puts about $45 million every year to help with the cost of tuition and room and board for those older foster youth who are going on to college. And in full disclosure, I mean, this was an event that, had different sort of policy sessions and some stuff throughout the day. The folks at Journey to Success had asked me to come and just say a few words at the beginning of a reception that they were doing at the Rayburn building on the first evening of the multi-day event around the Chafee Act. And they just really asked me to kind of, from my career covering lots of things in this space, reflect a little bit on the evolution of the role and influence of lived experience into policymaking and everything like that, which I was happy to do. And they were nice enough to let me kind of bum around and hear what people were talking about during the more policy-oriented stuff as well. So I just happened to be at the reception where this incident that we reported on went down. And again, I'm going to stress, we did a very good job reporting on this. Shout out to my colleague, Michael Fitzgerald, who kind of worked with me as this transpired in the day afterwards to just accurately portray what exactly had happened with this incident. So there was a reception, as I mentioned, and a number of different members of Congress, all of whom were members of the Congressional Foster Care Caucus, came through the reception, which was mostly attended by advocates, by policy staff and legislative staff on the Hill, and many, many former foster youth who were there, in an advocacy role. Okay. So one of the members, who is also the co-chair currently of the Foster Care Caucus was Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina. So she got up and to the podium, made a few remarks, kind of worked the room a little bit, and then headed out on her way. That is very typical. That is pretty much what most members of Congress do when there's a reception. I'm guessing, especially around the holidays, there's anywhere from, 1 to 10 similar receptions that they are asked to go to, show their face, say a few words to people, and all that. Now, some important context here for what I'm about to describe as the incident that occurred here. Representative Mace, in recent weeks, has been in the news for her, at the time, successful campaign to bar newly elected Representative Sarah McBride, who is a Democrat from Delaware, who is also transgender, from using the public women's bathrooms in the U.S. Capitol. It got a lot of ink. It was very highly publicized. So that had happened just a few weeks before this evening's event, which again was really focused entirely on the 25th anniversary of the Chafee program. Now, on one level, there's really not a lot of uncertainty about what happened next that, essentially becomes the incident that leads to an arrest of a former foster youth and advocate. Representative Mace finished up her remarks. As I said, she was sort of heading towards the door, and a former foster youth award-winning advocate for children and child welfare, James McIntyre, 33, of Illinois, walked up to her, shook her hand, and while shaking her hand, told her that trans youth deserve advocacy as well. And pretty much every account, not pretty much, every account supports that is what was said, that trans youth deserve advocacy too. What then becomes at odds is the handshake between the two of them. We have, at the Imprint, reported from multiple eyewitnesses who observed it to be, just simply an energetic handshake that any constituent might have with a member of Congress that they met. That was not how this interaction was relayed to the Capitol Police by Representative Mace and presumably one of her assistants or staff members who was also there at the time. I'm just going to read from our reporting, which accounts for the affidavit that was filed in court. Mace offered her right hand to the approaching McIntyre, who then placed his hand, and quoting from the affidavit, on top of the victim's hand in a clasping manner, so that the victim's hand was between both of the subject's hands, end quote. She reported that McIntyre then, and quoting again from the affidavit, began to aggressively and in an exaggerated manner shake her arm up and down in a handshaking motion, end quote, with, and a quote again, her arm flailing about for about 3 to 5 seconds, end quote. Okay, and it's during this handshake motion that McIntyre tells her that trans youth deserve advocacy. The affidavit also notes that Representative Mace told the police that she was in shock and felt intimidated by McIntyre's behavior. She declined any medical assistance, but just reported that she felt pain in her arms and her wrist. And the next day was seen, by myself and by many others in photos that were posted on Twitter, wearing a sling on her right arm. And within a few hours of this incident and the report to the Capitol Police, McIntyre was arrested by Capitol Police, and the next day he was arraigned in a D.C. court where he pled not guilty to the charge of simple assault, which is a misdemeanor. Representative Mace quickly took to social media, particularly posting on Twitter, about the incident. Here is her account, which she posted at 8:43 p.m., not long after McIntyre was arrested. And I quote her here from Twitter: "I was physically accosted at the Capitol tonight by a pro-trans man. One new brace for my wrist and some ice for my arm, and it'll heal just fine. The Capitol Police arrested the guy. Your trans violence and threats on my life will only make me double down." I have checked recently on the case within the DC court's database. It is still pending. McIntyre, when he was arrested and arraigned, as I mentioned, pled not guilty. He was released on his own recognizance, but he was ordered to stay away from Mace, both in real life and digitally. So no tweeting about it, I would assume that means, or sending any messages, obviously, directly to her. He was also ordered to stay out of the District of Columbia, except for his business with the court pursuant to the case. The next court date is currently set for January 30th. The Imprint will continue to report on the developments as they come, both in the court case, which is obviously of tremendous consequence to McIntyre and people close to him, but also with the foster care caucus, which, as I mentioned, Representative Mace is the co-chair of, along with two other Republicans, Zach Nunn of Iowa, Don Bacon of Nebraska, and three Democrats. Those are Mary Gay Scanlon of Pennsylvania, Gwen Moore of Wisconsin, and Sidney Kamlager-Dove of California. I'm going to give you my sense real quick of the atmosphere around that caucus now and why we'll be paying attention as it pertains to the former foster youth who are very involved in advocating for legislation. Online, what went down at this reception sort of became very quickly a referendum on how injured Representative Mace was. Like, at what point is a handshake violent or injurious? Again, there really isn't a dispute on paper or in any account about what words were said. McIntyre told Mace that transgender youth need your support too. And in the police report, this is described as a threatening comment. But that all sort of glides by the question of if calling the police was necessary. Of course, anytime your safety in an ongoing way or the safety of others is in jeopardy, calling the police might be rational. Or if you anticipate ongoing costs and harm as a result of something, right? Everybody that's had their car vandalized knows you have to file a police report to hope to recoup anything, right? Things like that. I think there is a real anger and frustration by the people with lived experience in foster care who attended this, who heard about it, who know McIntyre, that in this situation, a co-chair of this caucus would escalate a situation like this one because the interaction was over. There was no medical attention sought. There was no risk to anybody in an ongoing way. And I think you would see online now, if you follow a lot of national foster youth advocates, the ones who have experienced foster care, the ones who work with them, a quiet solidarity with McIntyre online. You'll see lots of blue images on social media that say alumni of Foster Care United in Action or ally of Foster Youth United in Action, where you might otherwise see somebody's profile pic. I think that is like a quietly suggestive of the fact that there's this ongoing legal case, and probably rightfully so, a hesitance to really be vocal about everything that happened as that's proceeding. But eventually, that's going to be over. And I think you will see overt calls at that point for Representative Mace to exit this caucus, or at least the co-chair position if she hasn't already done that. I do think that there's a tremendous frustration that she felt the need and took that step given the circumstances. I also think you might see a little more attention to just how people become the co-chairs of the caucus in the first place or join the caucus at all. I've kind of asked around some Hill operators, and my sense is it's very fluid and hard to control, this caucus process. There isn't really somebody, one person who's in charge that can stop a member of Congress from affiliating themselves with a caucus, or it's also really unclear to me like how somebody is elevated to be the co-chair of one, or how somebody might be asked to leave that. The only thing I did dig up that kind of does, convince me that there is at least some process by which admission can be denied, or I guess people could be expelled, is there was a situation one time where Representative Pete Stark of California, who represented a part of California with a very high African-American population, sought to become a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And the Congressional Black Caucus took a vote and denied him admission. And it was a civil back and forth. He felt the need to do that because of who he represented. They did not feel that was appropriate, so they did not accept him. Anyway, I say all that to say that suggests to me that there is some semblance of procedure, although I'm frankly surprised that it's kind of been hard to really ascertain. But we'll keep picking at that. And like I said, we're going to keep an eye on all this stuff as it proceeds. And I would strongly suggest that if you want to just familiarize yourself with everything that occurred at this reception, and afterwards, read the two stories that I have linked to in our show notes about this. And just going to tack on here, since I actually was not ever able to deliver my remarks at this reception, because actually they just had so many members of Congress show up, which is really heartening. I think that they were I have no problem with this, but I think they wanted to kind of secure a few people they knew would show up and make the remarks. You never know what's going to happen with congressmen and congresswomen and their busy schedules, but a lot of people showed up, so there was no time for me. What I was going to say, because I was asked to talk about sort of the evolution of lived experience, and maybe I'm not the best person to talk about as somebody who has not spent one day of their life in foster care, but I have been covering child welfare and youth justice for more than 20 years now, which makes me feel super old, as does the gray hair on my head. What I was really going to say was that I think, the Chafee Act and the passage of the Chafee Act was a really good example of sort of the original influence that young people with lived experience in this system were able to have. That law passed because after the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which was, at that point, a celebrated solve on the federal level to the fact that kids were spending way too long in foster care. They were languishing there and spending a long time. And so the idea of ASFA was to move up the timelines and force these systems to start moving towards other forms of permanency, in a quicker way. And obviously, like we've talked about on this podcast, that's become controversial for sure in the years afterwards. But kind of on a tour celebrating the passage of ASFA at the time, former First Lady Hillary Clinton went out to California and she met with a bunch of foster youth that were organized by some adults that were in their life. Robin Nixon was one of them. Robin Nixon, one of the great organizers in this space of all time. And, they really made sure that First Lady Clinton heard that while ASFA might succeed in finding permanency or ushering some foster youth to permanency faster, there were still thousands and thousands of foster youth who were just aging out at the time at 18, all of them, into adulthood and just being wished luck at the end of the door. And a lot of those kids were experiencing homelessness or involvement with other systems, or really bad outcomes that tend to happen when you are just pushed out onto your own at the age of 18. And what I was going to say, I don't want to go through my whole speech, was that was a way in which lived experience can have an influence. You have adults that are in the life of foster youth or former foster youth, and they knew to expose policymakers and people of influence to what those young people had to say. And what's really remarkable about that, of the moment now versus then, is that certainly the accumulation of lived experience and perspective from it that travels up the pipeline from adults who are professionals in policy and advocacy to members of Congress, that still happens. That is still a vital way by which policy and legislation is shaped. And there's nothing wrong with that. What's different to me about the moment now versus then is you still have that going on, but you have members of that lived experience community who have come out of foster care, who have experienced that, who have experienced aging out into adulthood, or who have had interactions with the justice system since, or have experienced homelessness, not only playing that vital role, but actually getting into different positions of power all across the spectrum. I'm just going to throw some examples that I was going to kind of call out on that night. You got the folks at Unbelievably Resilient, who we are proud to partner with through Safe Camp Audio. That podcast speaks directly to kids who are in foster care today or who have experienced it in a really compelling way. So they're in the media. They're controlling new versions of social media. You have a person who spoke at that reception earlier in the evening, Rebecca Jones-Gaston, who is just winding up her tenure as the commissioner of the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. It's one of the top child welfare positions in the federal government. She spent time in foster care. She was adopted. She then went on to work within the fields as a social worker. She ended up running Maryland's child welfare system and Oregon's child welfare system, and then taking that knowledge and coming to the federal government. And she isn't even the only one of late who's had that position, who has experienced foster care. Brian Samuels, who now leads Chapin Hall, one of the premier research and analysis and advocacy, entities within child welfare, So that's another prominent position held by somebody who has also experienced the system, and he experienced it in kind of an interesting way. I'll throw our interview with Brian into the show notes if people want to listen. But he lived in a residential center away from his parents for most of his adolescent life. Chris Scott, who started Connecticut Sun Scholars as a centralized way to help young people in Connecticut who have experienced foster care, better connect and acclimate to college life there. These are just a few examples. My overall point is the presence of lived experience now is undeniable, and it's everywhere. It's not something that is going to just be vetted through the adults who happen to be paying attention to kids and pipelined up, for the occasional witness at a hearing or anything like that. It's everywhere. The people who are the advocates, who are leading and connecting members of Congress to that lived experience now, are they themselves people who have experienced these systems. So I wanted to put all that out there at the reception because I think that is just really something tremendous. And I think we're not nearly done with the evolution of figuring out how best to situate lived experience. I do think, and I did talk to Rebecca Jones-Gaston about this when she came on this podcast, that we're past the moment where it truly feels more often than not like it is tokenish and that it is being taken seriously. But there's a lot to be proud of in that way, particularly for the young people who have an entrepreneurial spirit about starting new things in media, or those who were willing to take an experience that for a lot of them was probably pretty crappy and put themselves through the schooling necessary, the training necessary, the work experience necessary to get to where they had these positions of influence. All right, so end of monologue there. Let's actually talk about some legislating that happened towards the end of the year and kind of spilling into early January. There was, as there is wont to be these days, sort of a last-minute push to just get stuff wrapped up before the end of the year. And there were a few child welfare-related bills that made it through and one that didn't. Let's go quickly through them all. And as always, I'm going to drop a link to the breakdowns that we produced of all this stuff. So if you want to just read up on it, you can do that. Probably the biggest one was the Protecting Americans' Children by Strengthening Families Act, which was a reauthorization of the Title IV-B program. Title IV-E is an entitlement. It is very large, puts billions of dollars in play for preventing the use of foster care, in some cases, paying for foster care, paying for adoption subsidies. Title IV-B is a smaller subset of funds that goes out to states with kind of a broader mandate of helping to pay for, court administration, reunification services, family preservation, post-adoption support. I really did that out of order, but you get the gist. It's kind of like an all across the spectrum support of funds. Okay, so this was a reauthorization that included, a general boost to funding, but also had a couple of different policy shifts within it. Probably the most prominent one was agreed to and kind of pushed by Chairman Jason Smith of the House Ways and Means Committee, and then Gwen Moore, who's one of those co-chairs of the Foster Care Caucus. What they did was include concrete supports such as housing or transportation or nutrition assistance as allowable expenses under 4B. So in addition to funding services aimed at keeping families together or getting families back together, you can now use your 4B money on more concrete things like helping somebody pay for their apartment to make rent, right? We know that there is a significantly unfair condition that often happens where somebody loses their kids to foster care for whatever specific reason, but because their housing situation is dicey, reunification becomes a problem, even though that housing was not the reason for the entrance into foster care or anything like that. So this is permitting this 4B account to be used in that way. Now, there's a lot of advocates who really want to have the larger 4E entitlement rewritten in this fashion. That is probably the biggest kind of ongoing criticism of the Family First Act, is that while it opened up the 4E entitlement in 2018 to support to prevent foster care, that support was rooted only into services. Now, I'll tell you, that was like a different time leading up to 2018. There were kind of like discussion drafts of the Family First Act that included housing support and financial assistance and things like that. The bill would have cost billions and billions of dollars in any sort of government, assessment of what the cost was going to be. And so that was kind of viewed at the time as like a reason why they had to limit it down to just the sort of mental health services, substance abuse supports, and parenting supports in general. I would look at this like somewhat as a foot in the door. I think the bigger prize would be if someday concrete supports make their way into the much, much larger entitlement as part of Family First. So that was one piece of the 4B reauthorization. There were a bunch of others. There was, some support around ICWA compliance, the Indian Child Welfare Act, $5 million made available for the Family First Act each year for grants that would help states and systems conduct evaluations of services that are approved by the Family First Clearinghouse. This is kind of an ongoing problem. A lot of states in their plans to draw down this foster care prevention service money are only picking the stuff that has the highest rating in the clearinghouse already. And the reason for that is because there's just not that burden to continue evaluating it in the same way. If you pick the promising practices, if you pick the ones that are rated kind of the middle rating of supportive, there is some onus on you to participate in doing the evaluations. And so I think that this $5 million is aimed at kind of greasing the skids to make more people feel like, okay, we're not taking on a service that we're going to get some money for, but ultimately it's going to cost us a ton of money to do evaluations of and things like that. There is also something within the 4B reauthorization that requires the presence of lived experience at the table more often. There's some support for caseworkers in there. There's also a little bit of regulating residential care. I'm going to fold that into another bill that was passed that I'll briefly talk about. And also there was a $35 million per year for grants to help develop meaningful relationships between youth in foster care and incarcerated parents. So like I said a million times before, and we'll say a million times again, links in the show notes for anybody that wants to read up a little bit more. All right, also passed by Congress, signed into law by President Biden is the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act. This was championed prominently by celebrity Paris Hilton, who herself has spent some time in residential care. And this bill, as well as the residential care provision in the 4B authorization, kind of make up like at least a growing interest, I would say, by Congress in what's going on in this arena. So the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, well, let me start actually with the 4B package. So what this does is requires that the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees almost all of child welfare policy, develops guidance around how states should collect data on well-being and alleged maltreatment in residential care, and also identify best practices on improving oversight of such programs. So we're talking about kind of getting out there and getting a feel for who has done well to make sure that residential care is safe and effective, wherever that is. And also to kind of get the ball rolling on how should we eventually, I'm guessing this is where they're going with it, make these states turn over regular periodic data to the federal government about what bad stuff might be happening there and what good stuff. So metrics on, well-being outcomes for kids, but then also on the negative side, making sure that there's some sort of like top-down knowledge about how often kids are alleging maltreatment, that they're abused or they're neglected within residential care, which many opportunities, not with Paris Hilton, but with foster youth, that's supposed to be where they're going because they may have experienced maltreatment at home, making sure that there is some semblance or path for that information to be tracked on the state level in a way that can be then added up and tallied and tracked by Congress. So that's the 4B package. The Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act instructs the Department of Health and Human Services to conduct a study, and I'm quoting here, to examine the state of youth and youth residential programs and make recommendations. And that study is to be carried out within 3 years by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. There are requirements that they liaison with young people who have lived experience with these places, with parents, with educators. So just taken in totality, these two things kind of spin off of, as like starter bills, the very harsh things that the Senate Finance Committee leadership had to say about the quality of residential care back at a hearing in 2024. They vowed at the time, Senate Finance ranking member Ron Wyden at the time said they were going to get serious about regulating this and looking into this area of child welfare, of juvenile justice. I mean, residential care is not limited to either one of those, and plenty of parents pay out of pocket, like Paris Hilton's did, for residential care. It looked like there was going to be another piece of major legislation moving through to President Biden's desk. That was the reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. But that got derailed at the last minute. So what this was going to do, and I think people feel like there is going to be a path for this to get back on the docket sometime this year. But what it was trying to accomplish, among other things, local workforce boards would be required. They're currently required to spend 75% of their youth funds through WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, on out-of-school youth. That's the terminology. And what the reauthorization would do is shift that out-of-school youth to opportunity youth as a definition. And within that, opportunity youth would include a foster youth who was in school but still had that status as a current or former foster youth to be served and count towards that 75%. It would also have provided provisional eligibility for youth seeking to enroll in a WIOA program. Like right now, a youth in foster care who showed up to a workforce center might be looking for some help with a career or job training or just connection to employment. They're going to be asked for a letter identifying them as a ward of the court so that they can prove their eligibility. Maybe they don't have that on them. Maybe they walk out frustrated and never come back. This enables these workforce centers to say, it's cool, we'll provisionally get you enrolled. You just have 40 days to get that together, and God willing, they also help them obtain any of that documentation or have somebody on the spot to do that. And then finally, there was $65 million in this reauthorization for new funding for youth apprenticeship programs. And then just as importantly, honestly, programs that help a young person get ready to even qualify for an apprenticeship, which is kind of a big problem in that space right now. I'm actually like the most bullish of any kind of line in the federal budget for youth going up. It would be apprenticeship. President Trump, and I'm not saying this because he was the host of The Apprentice. He showed some love for apprenticeship as a spending line in his early budgets, and we did see a very large increase in apprenticeship spending during his first tenure. So I do think that'll get done on some level, and it does sound to me like WIOA eventually is going to get reauthorized. This kind of became, if you were following, there was a continuing resolution to keep the government open and spending continuing towards the end of the year, which is kind of par for the course now, except that some very high-profile members of Congress, including Representative Mace, as well as advisors to President-elect Trump, like Elon Musk, kind of slammed that continuing resolution as going kind of above and beyond, and including new money and new changes and things like that. Representative Mace took issue with a number of different terms of art that were included in different parts of the bill, including the shift from out-of-school youth to opportunity youth. I'm not sure she was clear that that was done in part to help increase eligibility for youth in foster care, who she is the co-chair of the caucus about. But Representative Mace called that switch from out-of-school to opportunity youth, quote, woke nonsense. She said that about a lot of things within the bill. So like I said, decent chance that continues to move. I know that there'll be still some pressure to get that done in 2025. All right, we're going to take a quick break and then come back with some youth justice talk and new numbers on child abuse and neglect.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
So in 2010, the Bureau of Justice Statistics awarded $500,000 to a firm called Westat to conduct a study on juveniles who are charged as adults instead of within the juvenile justice system. I mean that to include, the juvenile courts, the juvenile facilities, juvenile probation, all that. And at the time, that came as really welcome news because what happens to youth in the adult system really remains one of the bigger blind spots in the realm of youth and family services. I would put it akin to knowing what happens after adoptions fail, or even how often adoptions fail, which I think we will start to be seeing some federal data on soon. Every state has at least one mechanism for charging a youth as an adult. Some states do so a lot, some do it almost never. We have virtually no visibility on the nature of those cases, what becomes of the youth who are involved, any of that stuff. So that deal got done, part of the 2010 spending. Then the study was delayed until at least 2015 and then 2016. And I will just add anecdotally that during this time, because I really thought that this was an important piece of information to start looking at, we often harassed the Department of Justice, poor comms people, about when this thing was coming out, and they just always had to keep saying, we'll look into it, and then now it's delayed to this year. So kind of gave up in 2017 after it was delayed again, asking about it, and just assumed that the survey had been buried alive, basically, in sort of a bureaucracy graveyard. So I was sort of shocked to find out from somebody, because they did not release they didn't put a press release out or announce it or anything, that the Bureau of Justice Statistics extremely quietly just put up on their website, Juveniles Charged in Adult Criminal Courts 2014. That is the name of the study. Overall, the authors identified 37,941 cases filed in adult court against juveniles in 2014. But the published report really just hones in entirely on a subset of the 23,553 cases from 23 states where the most serious charge was known at a disposition. So basically what it comes down to is, at the end of the day, this effort was stymied by the lack of data and unwillingness, I would say, by some states to mine it and share it with the people who are working on this study. So they really had to settle for taking this 23,000 plus case sample from 23 states, analyzing it, and reporting out now, more than 10 years after the year of the data, on what they found. Is it an already dated look at this issue that might be tainted by which states could or could not provide the information? Definitely. But even with those constraints, this is how blind a spot this is, even with all that, this is still for sure the most comprehensive view ever produced of what happens when youth are charged as adults. There are a couple of very small attempts to do this. I am remembering one in particular in Baltimore. I want to say it's something around like 2008 or 2009. And that study actually was the one that got me thinking, okay, this is something that really needs more exploration, because what they were finding in Baltimore was, I think they tracked, I can't remember the specifics, but it was like a year's worth of youth tried in adult court, and it was like something just over 100. The vast majority of them either got kicked back to the juvenile system, or their cases were dismissed, or they spent a ton of time in jail waiting for trial, and then that ended or pled down or whatever. So it was like not what people thought was happening in these cases. I'm going to link you to our breakdown for those that really want to go in depth on kind of what we found looking into this report that they didn't really seem to want anybody to pay attention to. But here's sort of the broad strokes. I'm just going to hit you with 5 things, maybe 6 things that I would say are takeaways from what was found here. And I'll start with what is probably the best news from this, and that is that there is good reason to think that there are way less youth who are charged in adult court today based on this sample that they came up with. And here's why. I mentioned that there were 23 states that were part of the set that they kind of did all of their work around here. 3 of those states, Michigan, North Carolina, and New York, had an age of upper jurisdiction below the age of 18. There's lots of different terms of art here for this stuff, but basically most states treat everybody before they're 18 as juveniles by default, and then everybody that's 18 and over as adults. And in most states, there's a way to transfer a kid into adult court, whether it's a prosecutor that does it or a judge that does it, or it's a law that just says, like, if they are charged with this, they have to be in adult court. That's called transferring. States like Michigan and North Carolina and New York, back at the point that this was done in 2014, considered some older teenagers to be adults in the eye of the law. In New York and in North Carolina, that was both 16 and 17-year-olds. In Michigan, it was 17-year-olds only. So those 3 states had that lower age. The other 20 states, you were, by and large, you were a juvenile until you were 18. Now, why this is important is because of those 23,553 cases, 15,410 of them occurred in just those 3 states, Michigan, North Carolina, and New York. For sure, that's in part because they are very high population states. Most of those other 20 states, not all of them, but most of them, are significantly lower population states, have way less kids than, the combination of North Carolina, New York, and Michigan. Although I would point out, Florida is in that list of 20, and that's probably as big or bigger than any of those states. So 65% of all the process cases of kids in adult court occurred in those states. And, population aside, it really also reflects the reality that for any specific policy about transferring kids into adult court, the biggest driver of youth into those settings, certainly in the year 2014, were simply laws that considered all 16 or 17-year-olds to be adults, regardless of what they had allegedly done. And so the cause for optimism here is that Michigan, North Carolina, and New York, since that time, have all raised their age to 18. So now they are on par with the majority of states. A lot of other states have done the same. We only now have 4 states that consider 17-year-olds to be adults. They are Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and Wisconsin. Georgia, Texas, and Wisconsin have always, at least since I've been covering this stuff. Louisiana actually raised its age since 2014, I think, and they have since lowered it back in the last year, as my colleague Jeremy Loudenbeck reported on last year. Now, that doesn't mean that, the number of kids tried in adult court is going to 0 in those 3 states, but, here's just a good barometer for the way in which I would say it's a virtual certainty that those 3 states are going to just see a tremendously less number of kids tried in adult court. In those 3 states, 64% of the adult court cases were misdemeanors. There are serious misdemeanors, don't get me wrong. There can be a violent act that is a misdemeanor, but by and large, they're less serious than felonies. Compare that to the other 20 states, 34% of the cases that were originated in adult court with youth were misdemeanors. 66% were felonies, or they were driving-related offenses. That was the other kind of weird, quirky part of this. About 30% of the adult court cases in those 20 states were for driving-related offenses, far more than in those 3 states of North Carolina, New York, and Michigan. Translation for all of this, as those 3 states move to a process where it has to be a decision to charge youth as adults, there's every reason to think that action will be taken less frequently, and that there's no reason to think that wouldn't have been the case also in the other states that have raised their age since this time. Another thing that really jumped out to me here, so there is a well-known phrase that was associated in the 1990s with the boom in policies such as direct filing for prosecutors or transfer statutes or, lower age ranges on juvenile justice, that led to more youth ending up in adult court. And that phrase was adult time for adult crime. That was the rhymey mantra of how to get tough on kids. The data in this report for 2014 suggests that more often than not, that is just not how these cases go down. So of the 23,000 plus cases that were traced in this report, only 44.5% resulted in a conviction in adult court. So in more than half the cases, when you think about the concept of adult time for adult crime, there was no time doled out at all by the adult system. If you're not convicted, you're not getting time. As for the concept of adult crime in that phrase, I think it would be safe to assume that the concept of that adult crime conjures up felonies for people, conjures up kids killing people, robbing people at gunpoint, things like that. But a misdemeanor offense was the most serious charge in 53% of the cases in this report. And few of those misdemeanors were for violent offenses or weapons possessions. They were for other things. So it's just worth noting that, when the charges were felony level too, the conviction rate was fairly high. It was 65%. It was 25% for the misdemeanors. So at least in 2014, the majority of youth charged in adult court were sent there for a misdemeanor offense and then not convicted by a court for that offense. Now, returning to the adult time part of adult time for adult crime, the most logical sort of leap to make from that phrase is prison, putting kids in prison for things if they acted like adults and did stuff like that. But even among the youth who were convicted, and remember that more than half were not, but of the ones who were convicted, very, very few were actually sent to prison. There were 19,141 cases with a known outcome when they did this study. Of those, 1,263 youth received a prison sentence. That's just 15% of the youth who were convicted. Others did get jail time, or they got a blended sentence that originated in a juvenile facility, according to the report. Probably, to me, the biggest bummer in the report and what it didn't have publicly available. And I've engaged with Bureau of Justice Statistics to see if I can maybe get some more information on this. But they sort of took all the outcomes that didn't involve, the adult system and lopped it into non-convictions. Just this general phrase that is dispensed of with the following note in the report. Non-convictions include dismissals, not guilty findings, deferred prosecutions, and cases sent back to juvenile or family court for processing. And I would just say that I would really think it would be valuable to know how that big basket of outcomes was parsed. Are we seeing tons of these cases get dismissed? Are youth going all the way to a verdict and being found not guilty? Are judges frequently looking at these cases, getting sent before them, and immediately saying, this is not right for this court, send this thing back to juvenile court? I think that would be valuable information. Maybe they have it, it just wasn't in there. Maybe that is fruit for another study on another day. And then finally, I think that this will not be a surprise to anybody that is familiar with the general demographic trends within the justice system. It was the youth who were tried in adult court were mostly male, and they were majority Black. 75% of the youth who were charged as adults are male. That roughly tracks with the overall trends of justice involvement if you look back just at juvenile arrests. And then Black youth are disproportionately involved among these cases. I should have mentioned earlier, this study honed in on the age range of 12 to 17, which is pretty much everybody that would have been arrested and tried in adult court as youth. Black children make up about 14% of that 12 to 17 age range, 38% of the cases. White youth account for 49% of that age range. They accounted for Hispanic youth. I know that that's not an entirely accurate box anymore, or really probably ever. 26% of the population, 21% of cases. The breakdown in sort of the nature of the charges and in the outcomes of the cases diverges very greatly between Black and white youth. And I'm sure that is quite correlated. So among white youth charged as adults, 14% were there for violent crimes and 1% were there for weapons. The comparable numbers for black youth, 39% for violent crimes and 8% for weapons. Then when you look at the outcomes of cases where that was known, 48% of white youth sentenced in adult court were to pay costs or make restitution only, which means they didn't get any sort of probation or time in jail or time in prison. 48% of white youth got that, only 13% of black youth. 9% of white youth were charged as adults and ended up with a prison sentence. 27% of the black youth did. And then sort of the other thing I want to dig into a little bit more, hopefully we can find out some more data from BJS about, is they looked at the type of charge at disposition and how often that matched the type of charge at arrest. So think about that as like, if you arrest a youth for X and charge him in adult court for that, at the point that the case is disposed of, does that charge still match? The lowest was 85%, and that was for weapons. So you could take that to mean 15% of the time that a youth was arrested and sent into the adult court system for a weapons charge, that top charge changed to something else. For most of the other types of charges, violent included, it was much higher. It was in that range of like 95 to 100% where it matched. And I think that this was included to suggest that, at the very least, the charges leveled at kids were on the up and up. And it does kind of suggest that, where it would be interesting to see more granularity would be the change in charges within a charge type. Like, just for example, let's say a certain level of violent offense triggered a statutory transfer to adult court, or it gave the prosecutors or the judges, leave to consider moving a kid. And that is the specific charge at the outset, but by disposition, it's still some sort of charge of a violent offense or it's a weapons offense, but not one that would have opened up that pathway to transfer the youth in the first place. So you can see where that's sort of ripe for gaming a little bit. I had one expert call that the transfer trap once to me, where you get this really high charge moving in adult court, then you extract a plea from the youth on some offense that were it the first alleged charge, this would have all started in a juvenile court anyway. So anyway, that's sort of our initial takeaways from this. We're certainly asking around about this, and we'll continue to update on anything else that surfaces. But I think I'm glad that something finally came out about this. Like I said, very imperfect, but to date, that's the most complete look we have at what happens after youth enter the adult court system. Last little other youth justice tidbit. Just before the holidays, President Biden famously issued more than 1,000 pardons and commutations, and one action within that was a very large set of people that applied. It was a commutation that applied to everybody who was on compassionate release and had been since the COVID-19 pandemic began. One name of that lot popped out and kind of drew a lot of public ire, and that was Michael Conahan, who was one of the two judges in the infamous Kids for Cash scandal in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. We had Marsha Levick of the Juvenile Law Center, who was a key person involved, and the Juvenile Law Center was very instrumental in surfacing the behavior of the judges, even really before, frankly, there was sort of a financial motive surfaced in that situation. They were hauling kids into detention for very minor infractions all the time up there. So I'll link people to that if you kind of want to go a little bit more in depth on exactly what happened up there in Luzerne County. But suffice to say, Judge Conahan was one of the two judges involved in basically taking kickbacks to make sure that privately run and built detention centers stayed full and mostly full of kids who really didn't need to be there. So the fact that Judge Conahan was commuted, or a sentence was commuted, drew a lot of anger. I'm going to quote from Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. This was not only a black eye in the community, but it also affected families in deep and profound and sad ways. Some children took their lives because of this. He's talking about the Kids for Cash scandal here. There was all kinds of mental health issues and anguish that came as a result of these corrupt judges deciding they wanted to make a buck off a kid's back. My kind of initial instinct when I heard about this, because at least 10 different people texted me as soon as it happened, was to find out what Marshall Levick and Juvenile Law Center's view of the action was. I wouldn't say that they were thrilled that Judge Conahan had a sentence commuted, per se, but to going to read to you from their view, they did support the president's actions on the broad kind of spectrum commutation because JLC believes in, quote, a compassionate justice system that rejects an historically hyper-punitive approach to holding people accountable. She also added, in talking to me, that she hopes Judge Conahan, quote, has reflected on the harm he caused to thousands of kids as he accepts this clemency today. And she added, quoting here again, we would like to see the same kind of compassion and mercy extended to children nationwide who continue to suffer harm from our juvenile and criminal legal systems. All right, last thing for this episode. So one of the two big federal child welfare data dumps every year came out last week, and it is the one that covers state-collected information about child abuse and child neglect. It is always called child maltreatment, and then whatever the year it covers is. So this one is called Child Maltreatment 2023. This stuff always lags behind by at least a year. What you get to see in this report is how many notifications to hotlines and reports there were, and for how many kids those reports were about, how many investigations of abuse and neglect occurred, how many confirmed victims of abuse and neglect there were. I know that the term confirmed is loaded. Substantiated is another term you'll hear, but they're identifying victims in a federal report, so that's what I mean by that. How many responses there were to those victims, and then of that response, how many involved foster care. Now, I have only had time to go over the national numbers so far, so I put a quick rundown together for our subscribers. That's, of course, in the show notes. Haven't really looked through the state anecdotal contributions that are always sort of in the appendix, which sometimes can be really interesting. Or if there's a state, in the data that's skyrocketed or plummeted, I don't know about that yet. But so you can go to our summary online about this, but just a quick summary here for you. We have seen for a while now this sort of trend in two directions. The number of reports of suspected maltreatment going up and up and up. The number of actual victims identified going down and down and down. The report side of that took a, kind of a hard turn during the first year of the COVID pandemic, where we saw the number of reports go down by like 10%. That was largely on the backs of the fact that schools were closed, and school professionals, who are the highest supplier of mandated reports to hotlines, really weren't in kids' lives like they were before. But we have seen the number of reports now reach 4.4 million referrals to CPS. That's a 3.3% increase from the 2022 figures. Just over 3 million of those children were involved in either a CPS investigation afterwards or an alternative response. So that's essentially the same amount as last year. So reports went up again. The number of confirmed victims of abuse and neglect was 546,159 for 2023. That is down 2% from 2022. And this is the fifth straight year that the number of maltreatment victims has declined to a record low. The total in that 5-year period, we're down 19% over that period. The other big piece of data that is included in the child maltreatment report every year is the number of maltreatment-related child fatalities that are captured within a given year. I do think there's just like a lot of people who feel like this is an undercount, or it doesn't exactly capture everything that's happened in a year. And I think you see that borne out, at least that last part, in the fact that the numbers are frequently adjusted up and down. This report includes an estimate of 2,000 maltreatment-related child fatalities in 2023. I say an estimate because Massachusetts did not provide data. So they really have like the 51 states and territories, and they have to estimate for Massachusetts. That is higher than the estimate for 2022 when they published it, which was 1,990. But like I said, they adjusted it. In this new report, the 2022 figure is 2,050. So in actuality, compared to that, this estimate for 2023 is just slightly a tick down. So that is the just quick summary of the top line stuff from this year's Child Maltreatment 2023 report, which you can read more about at the Imprint. Right, so that does it for our first headlines of 2025. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit Safe Camp Audio on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just go to imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle at the Imprint News, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. Get us anytime on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.